Welcome everyone to our special talk, Good Price of Reliable Recipes, Great Photos, the Australian Women's Weekly Cookbook and their influence on Australian food culture. My name is Katie and I'm Public Programs Coordinator at the Old Treasury Building. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge that the Old Treasury Building is on the unceded lands of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung, and we pay our respects to their elders past and present. This talk is presented as part of Rare Book Week and the public program of our current exhibition, Belongings, Objects and Family Life, which is now open at the Old Treasury Building. You can visit the OTB for free, 10 a.m. to 4 p.m, Sunday to Friday. Now to our wonderful presenter. Dr. Lauren Samuelsson holds a PhD in history and is an Honorary Fellow at the University of Wollongong. Lauren's research interests include cultural history, the history of food and drink, the history of popular culture and gender history. Her PhD thesis considered the influence of the Australian Women's Weekly magazine and cookbooks on the development of Australian food culture from the 1930s to the 1980s. And if you're interested in this area, and since you're listening to this, I'm sure you are, Lauren's first book, A Matter of Taste, comes out in November this year and is currently available for pre-order. And I've already got it on my Christmas list. Without further ado, I'll hand you over to Lauren for Good Price, Reliable Recipes, Great Photos, the Australian Women's Weekly Cookbooks and their influence on Australian food culture.
Thank you to Katie and the team at the Old Treasury Building for inviting me to speak to you all today. And of course, thank you all for coming along. As you've heard, my name is Lauren Samuelsson and I'm a food historian who for the past 7 years or so have researched the Australian Women's Weekly and the role that it played in the development of Australian food culture throughout the 20th century. And I'm here to tell you a little bit about that today, focusing on the cookbooks because it's Rare Book Week after all. I'll probably talk for just over half an hour and then, hopefully we can have a bit of a chat, and I'd love to hear all of your stories about the books that you might have. But before I start, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which I live and work, the Dharawal people, and pay my respects to them and to any Indigenous Australians here today. So when I was deciding exactly what to research about Australia's food culture, my mind, and I'm sure that many of your minds would go to the Australian Women's Weekly. It's just iconic in the home kitchen. And you've probably got a weekly cookbook or two floating around at home. I remember when I was a kid, sitting at my family's breakfast bar, perched on a stool, flipping through the pages of the children's birthday cake book, absolutely loving it, dreaming of cake and how cool I would be if my mum made me a cake out of that book for my birthday. And kids today still do the same thing. And the 25th reprint of the book was released in 2020. As I got older and became interested in cooking for myself because I had to feed myself, the Women's Weekly cookbooks were always there. And the magazines were sort of ever present in doctors' waiting rooms and hairdressing salons. And though we sort of have lost out on that because of COVID, I always loved flipping through those pages and looking at the pictures. And so thinking about this, I wondered if anyone had looked at the way that the weekly influenced Australian food and how it changed the way that we see food, the way that we eat, and ultimately what impact that has had on us today. And while some people had a bit of a look, I felt like I could really get into it. And so I was really keen to investigate. Now, while the children's birthday cake book might have been the first book that I thought of when it came to the weekly, it's just one of the many influential titles that the weekly released. Some of you might be familiar with some of the others, including the Chinese Cooking Class Cookbook, Best Ever Recipes, the Big Book of Beautiful Biscuits. You might still turn to them. You might have favorite recipes out of them that have stood the test of time. But what I wanted to know is where these recipe books came from, when did they start, why were they so popular? And hopefully I'll answer some of those questions for you today. But before we get to the cookbooks, we have to talk about the magazine. So let's go back to 1933, so 91 years ago, when the weekly first hit the shelves. And the weekly first appeared on Sydney newsstands on the 10th of June, 1933. And its creation was something of a miracle. It was a bit of a serendipitous event. This guy here on the screen is George Wernicke, and the weekly was his brainchild, his little invention. He thought that there was a space in the Australian media landscape for a woman's newspaper that focused on issues that were of interest to all Australian women. He wrote that his paper should have an unswerving Australian outlook, and so that it will become welcome in every Australian home from the outback to the industrial suburbs, we should make sure it does not cater to any one section of Australian society. So he came up with the idea for the weekly, but it never would have come to fruition if Sydney Newspapers Limited, which at that point was led by Frank Packer and ex-Labor politician Edward Theodore, hadn't just purchased a failing newspaper called The World, and they'd also purchased their printing facilities as well. And this was towards the end of the Great Depression, and they really needed to get those printing machines up and running. So they took a leap and they started the women's newspaper that Wernicke dreamed up. The weekly was an immediate success. They had estimated that that first print run, the first magazine, would sell around 50,000 copies, and they ended up selling around 120,000. So it was incredibly popular right from the very beginning. And food was central to the magazine from the beginning as well. Of course, it was one of the things of interest to women that Wernicke wanted to focus on. Tucked away on page 35 of the first magazine was a column titled What to Eat in Winter, and it was written by Kathleen Rice. Rice shared recipes for fish souffle, Welsh rabbit or Welsh rarebit, and sardine cigarettes. Next to this column was a call for readers to send in their best recipes, which would be judged, and the best recipe would win £5. And in 1933, that was an awful lot of money. So this was the weekly's first foray into food, and the food section of the magazine became very popular indeed. So when I was doing my PhD, I conducted a survey of readers of the weekly, and participants in that survey confirmed that the cookery section was really important to them. Of the 161 responses that I got from people, 103 of them indicated that the cookery section was one of the reasons, and often the only reason, that they purchased the magazine. So with food being so popular in the magazine, it is little wonder that shortly after starting, the weekly published its first cookbook. So the Frances Thompson cookery book was published in 1940, and it looks and feels very, very different to the cookbooks we know and love today. For a start, there are no pictures. Most cookbooks of the time didn't have them. And this was something that the weekly revolutionised, as we'll see later. But it was also written by a Canadian. Frances Thompson was the director of the Canadian School of Home Science, and she had just toured Australia in 1939, demonstrating her unusual cooking methods. She was lauded as the world's highest paid cook, and newspapers around the country, including the weekly, featured her recipes in them during her tour. The weekly went on to publish a collection of her recipes, and as you can see here on the screen, the book sold for 2 shillings and 6pence. And if you get to hold one of these copies of this book, it's remarkably light. It used incredibly sort of cheap paper. In there are 487 recipes, so a lot of recipes in the 200-ish page book, and it's divided into categories just as we would see today. There's appetizers and hors d'oeuvres, meat, beverages, cakes, drinks, those sorts of things. Thompson specially tested her recipes using Australian ingredients. She made note at the beginning of her book that she used Australian flour in testing these recipes, for example, because it was different to Canadian flour, to make sure that the recipes would turn out successfully for her Australian readers. And the publication of this cookbook which was written by a celebrity cook, we'll call her a celebrity cook, set the scene for the cookbooks published by the weekly from the 1940s through to the late 1960s. During these years, the weekly published 10 cookbooks, and of these, 3 were attributed primarily to the weekly staff. So there was the Australian Women's Weekly Economy Cookbook from 1953 and the Australian Women's Weekly Guide to Better Cookery from 1954, which I've got on the screen here. These were softcover booklets of between 50 and 60 pages, and they sold separately to the magazine for 1 shilling and 6pence. So they are quite difficult to find, and I've found them in some libraries, but if you ever come across them, I recommend buying them. The only hardcover cookbook produced by the Test Kitchen during these years was the Australian Women's Weekly Cookery Book, and that one was published in 1955 under the direction of Leila C. Howard. And 3 cookbooks from the period, the Australian Women's Weekly Cookery Book from 1948, Family Dinners from 1949, and Cookery for Parties from 1949, were actually compilations of recipes that were sent in by readers for various competitions that were held by the magazine. And once again, these were soft cover booklets. They were relatively cheap and accessible for everyone, and they were sold separately to the magazine. But very quickly, larger, more expensive cookbooks were printed, although they were reprints of international publications. So, for example, Picture Cookery on the screen here from 1952 and Cookery in Colour from 1960 were Australian reprints of British publications by Good Housekeeping magazine and also British celebrity cook Marguerite Patten. And Patten also collaborated with the weekly's food editor, Leila C. Howard, which was actually the pen name of the weekly's then food editor, Betty Dunleavy, with the publication of Step by Step Cookery in 1964. So there were all of these cookbooks being sold separately to the magazine, but really at this time, from the 1960s through to about the mid-1970s, the weekly's Test Kitchen was primarily focused on doing short cookbooks, 16 pages usually, that were printed as supplements to the magazine, and there were so many of these. They were usually printed in conjunction with various corporate sponsors, or they had various themes, and they were often pretty heavily geared towards advertising. So I've got a couple of examples here. So there's The World's Best Curries from 1967, the Banana Cookbook from 1970, the Canned Fish Cookbook from 1971, and there was also the Career Woman's Cookbook from 1973. And publication of these supplements halted in the mid-1970s at around the same time that the weekly started selling its A4 softcover standalone cookbooks. And we're really lucky that so many of these titles have been digitized and they are available on the NLA's Trove database. So if you're interested in them, that's a wonderful resource for you to go and have a look at a lot of these supplements that still exist, luckily, because of course, when we're talking about researching magazines, they're so often easily thrown away. The Australian Women's Weekly Cookbook from 1970 really marked a turning point in the weekly's cookbook offerings. It was released prior to Christmas in that year in a large hardcover format, and it contained over 650 recipes. And most of those, or many of those recipes, had previously been published in the magazine. The weekly had seen how well Margaret Fulton's cookbook had sold the previous year and basically thought that they would take advantage of people's interest in Australian cookbooks and create one of their own. The deadline to have the book done was really tight, according to Pamela Clark, who was working in the Test Kitchen at the time and who eventually would go on to become food director of the magazine. And the budget was incredibly low. Unlike today, there were no food stylists. The iconic cover image here, which you can see featuring casserole in a red dish with a matching ladle, was put together by Clark, who hastily painted the ladle to match the dish just before the image was shot. Despite this sort of rush to get it done, the book was actually really beautiful with gorgeous photographs of the food, even if to sort of our modern eyes, they seem a bit retro today. I'll be coming back to pictures later, but they were a really key part of the cookbook. And by 1977, the book had sold over 500,000 copies. Its success meant that in 1978, the weekly followed up with the Australian Women's Weekly New Cookbook, which was once again of a similar size, a large hardcover, but with new recipes that weren't contained in the first book. And they were obviously taking advantage of what was almost a decade of recipes that they could draw on from the magazine. So these were often, once again, recipes that had already been printed in the magazine. But by the mid-1970s, the Weekly began publishing its well-loved series of themed cookbooks, which were revolutionary at the time. So the books, which you're probably all incredibly familiar with, were sold in an A4 softcover format, and production costs were really minimal. They often reprinted recipes from the magazine, just like those bigger cookbooks. So the hard work and testing had all been done. It was just about putting them all together into a themed collection. The first of these cookbooks, Best Ever Recipes, was published in 1976. And it was the idea of the Weekly's editor at the time, Ita Buttrose, and its advertising manager, John Singleton. According to Pamela Clark, the book was really a surprising success. It was, it was a bit of an experiment, but it sold in excess of 1 million copies. The Weekly recognised the lucrative nature of these types of publications. As Pamela Clark enthusiastically exclaimed, they were a money spinner for the magazine. In these books, the Weekly had hit upon a recipe for success. And by the 1980s, the Weekly was publishing more of these magazine-style cookbooks, using not only its colour printing technology, but its in-house expertise and its expansive archive of recipes. By this time, the magazine was nearly 50 years old. So they had a massive archive of recipes to print multiple titles per year. And by the 1990s, newsagents were giving over whole display racks to these magazine-style cookbooks. And I'm sure that you can all remember that. So some of the Weekly's most popular titles come from this series, the Cooking Class Cookbook of 1977 and the Dinner Party Cookbook, as well as the Chinese Cooking Class Cookbook and, of course, the Children's Birthday Cake Book. And I'll return to Chinese Cooking Class and Birthday Cake in a minute. Readers were really enamoured with this new style of cookbook. They were cheap, they were available everywhere, the recipes were reliable, and they were, despite the lack of stylist, pretty visually stunning. One reader who responded to my survey, and I'm going to use pseudonyms for all of these sort of quotes that I'm using, and this one was from Teresa, loved that the books were cheap. She reminisced that I still have some with $1.99 on them. Due to their low cost, the home cook could purchase multiple cookbooks. They could build up a library of books that suited their personal tastes and interests. They didn't buy a big cookbook with sections that they would never turn to, so they could choose things that really interested them. They were also really readily available. The earliest of these cookbooks were sold through multiple channels. They were sold at news agencies, booksellers, and then they were also sold directly from the magazine via mail order. And by the 1980s, they were also being sold at the supermarket checkout, making them widely available, especially in regional or rural areas that didn't have a bookseller. That made them really available to a wide range of Australians. And the cookbooks were also imbued with the trust associated with the magazine's triple testing process. And home cooks that purchased the Weekly cookbooks did so because they contained lots of great, reliable recipes. The recipes always worked. The Weekly's cookbooks were regarded very highly, and readers favoured the cookbooks over the magazines for cooking content. So many people would buy the cookbooks and not buy the magazine because the cookbooks really had broader appeal and they weren't as linked with the genre of women's magazines, which led to a large audience. So one of my respondents, Hazel from Ararat in regional Victoria, said that she didn't read the Weekly magazine as she wasn't interested in that form of journalism, but she did buy many of the cookbooks. She said that she assumed that the recipes in the books came from the magazines originally, but the cookbook genre held more appeal to her personally. And these cookbooks also found a male audience, as many men would have been reticent to purchase the magazine every week simply because of the stigma surrounding the genre of women's magazines, but they were very happy to use the cookbooks. And a significant part of the appeal of the cookbooks was the photography. Not only were the photographs themselves appealing to readers, but they liked that the photos were a real portrait of the food if you cook it like it says. Illustration had long been an important part of the weekly's food offerings. The magazine had been at the cutting edge of technological advancement when it came to colour printing, especially. It introduced the first colour rotogravure printed edition of the magazine in 1936, and that was the first of its kind in Australia. George Wernicke claimed that it marked an epoch not only in the history of Australian printing, but of printing in the British Empire. So he was very proud of it. And these are images from that first colour printed cookery feature, which appeared in 1937, so about 87 years ago. It was a 16-page booklet that contained 4 brightly coloured images, as well as numerous black and white images as well. One colour photograph showed a variety of cakes, iced in pink and blue and chocolate icing, arranged attractively on a green and white checked tablecloth. The other colour images included a photograph of a pink iced chocolate cake and illustrations of an omelette and a dinner of meatloaf, cauliflower, carrots, and meringued apples. And all of those are up on the screen now. And from 1938, the food pages regularly featured colour images. Even during the Second World War, the food pages retained those colour images. According to historian Dennis O'Brien, who wrote a history of the magazine for its 50th anniversary, during the Second World War, the weekly looked oddly extravagant with colour pages and gloss compared to other magazines in Australia. And during the years of paper rationing, copies were sort of passed around from house to house. The cookery pages survived the war years, unlike many other sections of the magazine, which were unceremoniously slashed. Issue sizes dropped from around 50 pages to around 24, so the cookery section was really taking up quite prime real estate in the magazine. There was usually at least one colour image per food editorial, and you can see here the cover and the food page for an issue from 1943, which was really deep into paper rationing in the country. So, also, although they weren't the magazine's target demographic, Australian troops serving overseas apparently really appreciated the use of colour in the magazines. In an article published on the magazine's 21st anniversary, a staff writer reminisced that during the war, the magazine kept its colour covers and cookery and claimed that those coloured cookery pages achieved pin-up status to men on hard rations. So apparently images of food were good for morale. If coloured food pages in the magazine were popular, then the cookbooks were no different. And the magazine promoted its cookbooks based on the illustrations. Obviously, the most visible point of this is actually, a cookbook called Picture Cookery, for instance, which was heavily invested in its illustrations. The book boasted 24 colour plates for recipes, as varied as oysters, au naturel, rum baba, and strawberries with ice cream. And we can see the pictures of the oysters and the strawberries there. Picture cookbooks such as these were pretty revolutionary, and the weekly would continue to publish lavishly illustrated cookbooks that were appreciated by its readers. So another respondent to my survey, Eleanor, vividly recalled that she drooled over every photo while reading the Chinese Cooking Class Cookbook with a friend in the 1980s, while others reminisced about choosing their birthday cake from the pictures in the children's birthday cake book, as I once did. These 2 cookbooks have sold over 4 million copies each in the decades since their publication, so they were obviously doing something right. And it's to these 2 cookbooks that I will turn now, because I think they're some of the weekly's most important books. Now, the Chinese Cooking Class Cookbook was released in 1978, and it was reflective of the uptake of Chinese food in the domestic kitchen. Until the 1970s, many of the ingredients and utensils needed to successfully make Chinese cuisine were just not accessible to the everyday home cook. The book, which was edited by Ellen Sinclair, offered readers 118 recipes ranging from abalone soup to wonton wrappers. The book included recipes for sort of anglicised Chinese meals, such as chow mein and chop suey, but it also included more authentic recipes for dishes such as beggar's chicken and steamed pork buns, which required a little extra work. Even so, the recipe for steamed pork buns did stipulate that the cook could purchase pre-cooked pork from a Chinese food store if they liked, which would make the dish easier to create. Now, the availability of ingredients for Chinese cooking was addressed on the first page of the cookbook, with Sinclair assuring readers that most of the special ingredients used in Chinese cooking are now available at large supermarkets and food stores. You may have to visit Chinese food stores to buy such items as 5-spice powder, Chinese chili sauce, and wrappers for spring rolls and wontons. And so, as you can see, even then it was quite different to our access to all sorts of Chinese ingredients, as well as utensils like woks today, which we can get, in most mainstream stores. And the Chinese Cooking Class Cookbook was really a raging success, and many of the readers that did my survey remembered using it. Eleanor, who drooled over every photo when reading the book for the first time, shared her experience pretty vividly. She said that she still remembered way back in 1980 when she first read the book, that she was so taken with the photos that she decided to have a dinner party where she and her friend would share the cooking. She said it was one of the best evenings ever, and her deep fried ice cream balls were the best. I haven't tasted better since at any of the Chinese restaurants that I have visited. So the book really presented Chinese food as being something pretty special. However, the step-by-step instructions would have helped intrepid cooks like Eleanor in their quest to cook Chinese for themselves. Now, researching what we eat based on old cookbooks can sometimes be pretty difficult. Often when we buy cookbooks, we read them. We don't necessarily cook from them. How many of you have sat down with a cup of tea or curled up in bed with a cookbook? It's a really delightful thing to do. But how many of those recipes did you make? Maybe you made a couple of them. Maybe you made none of them. So cookbooks are really better at telling us what people think they should be eating rather than what they were necessarily. Sometimes, however, they do tell us. And I found my particular copy of the Chinese Cooking Class Cookbook in an op shop. And it was one of those books that told me what people had cooked. Sometimes you might find that out because the book sort of automatically opens to a particular page that's, been well used as you flick through it. And perhaps some of the pages are really well loved and they've been dripped upon with batter or other ambiguous stains of food. But in this case, the previous owner of my particular book had left me clues. Throughout the cookbook, they had written notes about who they were going to cook these meals for on the recipe. Here we will see that my book's previous owner made the combination chop suey for their mum and dad. I will never know if they liked it. I will never know if they made it again. They gave it a tick, so maybe they did like it. But I do know that at least once somebody ate combination chop suey made from this book. And you find these little notes in cookbooks when you have a flip through them. Here's another example from Guide to Better Cookery, one of the weekly's first cookbooks, where the owner has actually added in their own recipe for what they called breakfast eggs. And these sorts of finds are real treasures. So if you ever find old recipe books from the library, perhaps, or in op shops yourself, keep in mind that they might offer you up some clues about what other people were actually eating in the past. And they can be wonderful historical sources. Now, to probably the most iconic women's weekly cookbook ever published. When Ellen Sinclair, Pamela Clark, and the rest of the Australian Women's Weekly Test Kitchen staff decided to publish a book of birthday cake recipes in 1980, little did they know that they were creating what has since been called the greatest book ever published in this country. On the contrary, the making of the book was a little bit slapdash. The cakes were made directly on bench tops, the backs of the cakes were often left undecorated, and photos were taken after Sinclair had given the instruction to shoot it, little darling. But there was no food styling involved. The cakes were, in the words of Pamela Clark, a little bit messy, a little bit tacky, but also filled with sentimental loveliness. While the test kitchen was pleased with the book, they were pretty shocked to see that it didn't sell strongly to begin with, unlike some of their other titles, which sold out remarkably quickly. People weren't buying the book until there was a birthday in the family, and there was sort of no need for a birthday cake book unless there was a birthday happening. So it took a little while to really get sales going, but once sales started, there was really no stopping it. And as I said earlier, it's been reprinted at least 25 times since its publication. So it is incredibly popular. And it's also become an integral part of our popular culture since its publication. In 2009, comedian Josh Earl wrote and starred in a comedy musical show titled Josh Earl versus the Australian Women's Weekly Birthday Cake Book, which ran from 2009 to 2015. And it featured songs such as The Train Cake, which you should be able to find on YouTube if you're interested. Most recently, The Duck Cake and the book from which it springs appeared in an episode of Bluey, which was titled Duck Cake. So its integration into our popular imaginary, it really ensures that this book and the cakes that we bake from it will be around for a long time. And some of you probably have a copy of the children's birthday cake book kicking around in the back of a cupboard, or maybe it's in relatively high rotation and being brought out for family birthdays. You also may have childhood memories, like I do, of choosing one of the cakes. If you are a parent, though, you may have feelings of anxiety associated with the book. Looking at some of these constructions, wondering if perhaps you'll have a cake fail and disappoint your child. We recently saw an outpouring of appreciation for the birthday cake book. In early 23, the Bendigo Art Gallery planned its exhibition celebrating 93 years of the weekly, and they asked people to send in pictures of themselves and their family with photos of cakes that they made from the birthday cake book. And they received 3,000 photos when they put the call out, and they displayed 1,000 of them on an epic wall mural. So the birthday cake book is obviously incredibly important to so many people. But beyond these sort of personal memories and anxieties, this book, with more than 100 recipes for cakes, as well as instructions on how to pipe icing and make marshmallow flowers and colour coconut with food dye and push dolls into biscuits and put them into jelly on a pool cake, provides us with a window into Australian culture. Because cakes and baking have always been central to Australian food culture. In the late 19th century, Lady Victoria Buxton reported that Australia should be called the land of cakes, as the young ladies are remarkably good cake and scone makers. And this stems from the fact that from the mid to late 19th century, the basic ingredients for baking, flour, butter, eggs, and sugar, were abundant and pretty readily available. And Australians also consumed great amounts of sugar. At the turn of the 20th century, Australia's per capita consumption of sugar was unbelievably high, almost 25% more than Britain's at 104 pounds, or almost 48 kilos per person per year. And to sort of put this in perspective, I've got a little graph, but sugar consumption peaked in 1951, and today we consume a little bit less at 42 kilos per year, which is still pretty high, as calls for a sugar tax and concerns about our nutrition sort of reveal. But Australians have long had a sweet tooth. And in the mid-20th century, baking was one way that housewives could prove themselves, and making a cake from scratch was really the only acceptable way. But by the 1970s, the packaged cake mix was becoming a suitable substitute for women who were increasingly, in the words of the weekly, busy. This shift was entwined with changing gender roles. More women were working outside of the home, yet like today, they were still expected to undertake the lion's share of domestic duties, including cooking. And one shortcut that the weekly suggested was using cake mix, which is why the birthday cake book, the test kitchen specified using butter cake packet mix for the cake itself. But why birthday cakes? Well, birthday cakes, as we know them today, are also a pretty new phenomenon, having not been labelled as such until the late 19th century. And throughout the 20th century, birthday cakes became increasingly significant. The centrepiece of the birthday party, They are significant cultural artifacts in and of themselves. To have a wonderful or inspiring cake baked just for you on your special day is a symbol of status and prestige, and is often a cultural reflection of the child's identity. You know, is the child a girl or a boy? Do they like trains or racing cars, horses or cats? And as birthday cakes became important to the child, they also became important to the child's mother. And by the 1980s, the preparation of a birthday cake for a child carried with it elements of conspicuous consumption and competition, as well as connotations of maternal love and care. So while a woman working outside the home may have found it difficult to be a successful housewife or homemaker, she could still demonstrate her success as a mother. And one of the ways in which she could demonstrate that mothering prowess was through the creation of a novel children's birthday cake. And the use of cake mix leveled that playing field somewhat. Which is not to say that making some of the cakes in the birthday cake book was an easy feat. Some of them were notoriously difficult. As Pamela Clark has pointed out, the tip truck cake is a treacherous affair. In an interview I had with her, she said that the cake was almost impossible, and she advised many parents to avoid it. She said, people would phone, and this was when the test kitchen had many phone lines, they would phone and say, I'm going to make the tip truck cake. Oh, I said, because I made that tip truck, and I tried to steer them off it because it's such a monster of a cake to make. I'm going to make the tip truck for little Johnny, and have you got any extra tips? And I say, don't make it, that little Johnny gets something else. Yet parents were undeterred, and many stayed up all night baking a cake for their child. As Clark pointed out, the child really doesn't care if the cake is perfect or not, if it's a bit ratty and a bit tacky and whatever. Rather, it was the desire to do something that nobody else can really do well for your child that prompted this emotional and literal labour. So the Children's Birthday Cake book is undeniably an important historical object, and looking at it can tell us all sorts of things, from the changing expectations of women's labour to the changing experience of childhood, and how Australians continue to nostalgically celebrate our long history of baking and our love of sweet treats. As people share their love of this book and the cakes that they create out of it, embracing humour with the fails as well as the joy of their successes, the book has become something that its creators really never expected. And of course, while it may be the most famous of the weekly's cookbooks, it is just one of the hundreds that the magazine has published. The topics that they have covered are numerous and tell us about the changing food culture of our nation, and are also reflections of our social history. They're really part of our social fabric. And on that note, I'm going to finish up, and I'd love to hear any stories that you have about your women's weekly cookbooks, or answer any questions you might have as well.
Thank you, Lauren. That was absolutely wonderful. And I have to admit, I'm very pleased it's almost lunchtime. You're making me very hungry. While you take a breath and everyone furiously types their questions into the Q&A, I'll let you all know about the next instalment in the Making Public History's seminar series, History on Film, which will be held next week on Thursday, the 25th of July at 5 p.m. Emeritus Professor Peter McPhee and Dr. James Finlay explore the questions raised by two very different films, the blockbuster Napoleon and the searing colonial drama The Nightingale. Tickets are available on the History Council of Victoria's website. Now, to the questions. What I would like to know, Lauren, is how many of the books do you own? And do you have any that you're desperate to get, since we're talking Rebel Quick?
I own quite a few. Every time I go to an op shop, I do, keep an eye out, and people tend to send me them as well, or give them to me if they find them, which is really great. There are a few that I would like to get my hands on. There's a bunch of you can actually, I've got the thing on the screen, these books that are like Great Ways of Steak and Chops, the Great Chicken Cookbook, those sorts of ones. They're actually like a series that was published in the early 70s, and they're quite sort of hard to get your hands on. And I took photos of those at a library, but I would like to have a set of those, because there's a cheesecake cookbook in that set that is fantastic.
Brilliant. Talking lists, do you have a bibliography of the Australian Women's Weekly cookbooks you could share?
Now, someone Dudley Jackson, a researcher, actually did one. And it is, he self-published it, but it is available at various libraries. And so if anyone ever wanted to get the full overview, and I'm very grateful to him for doing that work, because he trawled through library catalogues to put together this amazing list of cookbooks up until 2010. But of course, they're still publishing them. So maybe that's something I'll have to do, is add to it.
Perfect. To what extent do the themed cookbooks reflect Australia's migration history? You mentioned the Chinese, and the writer of this question says they have the easy Malaysian cookery, but there are others that reflect more recent arrivals.
Yeah, I mean, they definitely do reflect that migration history. And when I was talking to Pamela Clark, she actually gave me a good example of the way that the weekly sort of timed releasing some of these cookbooks to when the wider Australian public might be ready to accept some of these more international foodways. So, for example, they tried to release a Thai cookbook in the early 1990s. And at that stage, Thai restaurants were, there were a few around, but they weren't as popular and common as they are today. And the book didn't sell because the public just wasn't ready to accept it. It wasn't flavors that they were necessarily familiar with. But then they re-released it, a couple of years later, and it sold well once people had sort of become familiar with those flavors. So there are definitely patterns to the way that they release them. And these are cookbooks that aren't sort of like at the cutting edge. They're not introducing brand new things necessarily, but they are sort of familiarizing people with them.
Yeah. So as we saw with I think it was the Chinese book, they mentioned you can go to Asian grocers to get these sort of things. So they're less like, go and get this, rather than you can find this at Woolies.
Yeah, exactly. So it was for sort of the everyday Australian. It wasn't necessarily for people who were, out scouring, the little grocers and things like that for fun ingredients. It was for everyday people.
Brilliant. A technical question. How do you search for these cookbooks on Trove?
So for the little pull-out cookbooks themselves, you kind of just have to scour. If you know the title of the one that you're looking for, you can just search for that and it will generally pop up. But really it is going through each edition of the weekly that's on Trove and seeing if they've got the cookbook attached. Some of them are missing and I've had to chase some of them down. But yeah, it's really going on a hunt.
Yeah. Have you stumbled upon any that on Trove that you were like, when did this happen?
Not cookbooks per se, although there are some pretty wacky ones, especially when you're talking about like diet cookbooks and things like that. Yeah, so there's some pretty wild things in there. But just like strange recipes that pop up and what have you. And especially when it comes to things like dinner parties and like telling, because they weren't just cookbooks, of course, they sort of told people how to host a party and what their roles were. And so it sort of gives you an insight into what people were actually sort of doing in their home or being told how to host a party anyway. So there are all sorts of surprising things that pop up.
That's brilliant. Someone's shared a memory. Thank you so much. Your presentation was very interesting and well researched. When the author was 10 years old, their dream was to work in the test kitchen when they grew up.
That's wonderful.
Do you think there's any gaps that you're surprised that something hasn't been made into a cookbook?
In past ones, probably not. I really do feel like they covered most bases. They were releasing cookbooks very regularly. And so, of course, they had to come up with things. So I think that they were sort of just like spreading out far and wide to get some ideas, especially in those little the supplement ones. But I think that they do sort of, even now, they do sort of just jump on the trends of things that are, happening. So, at the moment, there's lots of like vegan cookbooks and superfoods and all of those sorts of things. They're quite trendy. They do tend to follow those sorts of things. So I don't think they've missed anything glaring.
Fair. How long did your PhD take to complete, and what's next?
It took 4.5 years to complete. And then another couple of years working on turning that research into a book. And next I'm looking at various other bits and pieces, but maybe looking at doing a history of vegetarianism and veganism in Australia in the 20th century. So we'll see.
That very interesting.
I talk a lot about meat, so I need to not do that anymore.
You mentioned that the men would buy the cookbooks because of the less stigma associated by the magazine. Were any of the cookbooks specifically targeted towards them?
Not the cookbooks, but there were often competitions in the magazine that were for men. So men send in your recipes. Mm-hmm. There was one in 1980, I think, called, Marvelous Men Cooks. So, there was this idea that men, should be cooking or could be cooking anyway. But I don't think that there were any specifically for men that I can think of off the top of my head. Although there were some, like the Great Ways with Steak and Chops, which I'm sure would have appealed to the more manly reader.
Mm-hmm. No cooking for bachelors or...
No cooking for bachelors that I'm aware of, certainly not in the cookbooks.
Fair. You mentioned that the weekly tried to appeal to a broad base, but it also led in some ways to new ingredients or the use of healthy cooking methods. Were there, this is what a wok is, that sort of stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, so it was definitely like they were teaching people about a lot of these things. And I was speaking with Lindy Milan, who was the food director of the weekly, late 90s through to the sort of early 2000s, about how she made a concerted effort to teach people to not cook with butter, but to cook with olive oil. So, they were making choices sort of behind the scenes on what they were going to teach people. It wasn't just sort of led by fads. And so, yeah, it was very much teaching people how to cook, and the step-by-step instructions really helped. And lots of people that did my survey were talking about how they loved that step-by-step instruction, because if they followed them, they would have something edible at the end.
Fair enough. Speaking of your interviews, someone comments, the Women's Weekly cookbooks were essential in my sister and I learning to cook in the 1980s as children. Did any of your other interviewees experience the same?
Yes, lots of people talked about how the cookbooks helped them to learn how to cook. One of the respondents, and brings me back to the other person who was talking about how they wanted to work in the test kitchen, was talking about how they would read through the cookbooks and then they would pretend to be a TV cooking host. And they would pretend that they were, cooking these recipes, pretending that they were on TV, and they actually became a chef when they grew up. Aww. So, they really did sort of teach people how to cook. And lots of people, like, I didn't necessarily learn how to cook, so I did rely on things like cookbooks to teach me what to do. So lots of people were in that boat.
Absolutely. Oh, and Cooking for Bachelors was a book done in the 60s by Ted Maloney and Deke Coleman, advertising men. Margaret Fulton worked for them. They also wrote Oh for a French Wife and a few others.
Yes.
Yeah. Do you think we're at the end of the cookbook era? The market is saturated. There's a cookbook for everything, and recipes are also available online. Do you see a future?
I think the cookbooks will always hold some appeal. I think especially with cookbooks like the Women's Weekly that go through rigorous testing. They still do their triple testing. They still do all of that to ensure that they come out right. I know that I've made recipes from the internet that have obviously, not been tested and therefore do not turn out right. So I think that things like this will probably continue, but yeah, the cookbook market is, highly saturated, and there is a cookbook for everything. And people are sort of self-publishing and all of that sort of stuff as well. But I do think that there is a real pleasure in sitting down with a cookbook and flipping through it as well. So it's hard to say, but I think that they will stick around.
Yeah, I think so. And as you said, when it opens on a specific page that everyone's used, or you're like, what's that? No. And I'm very pleased that because I write in my cookbooks crap, change this. So I'm very pleased that I've been given permission to do that.
Continue to do that.
If we've got no more questions, we'll end that today. Thank you so much, Lauren. And a reminder for everyone watching that Belongings, Objects and Family Life is on display at the Old Treasury Building till next year, 2025. And we're open 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. Sunday to Friday. Thank you to everyone watching. And thank you so much, Lauren. It was a really fascinating discussion. And I hope everyone has a lovely rest of their day.
Thank you.